The most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is mistake a quiet woman for a weak one. The crystal chandeliers of the Beaumont Grand Hotel scattered golden light across the Manhattan ballroom as America's wealthiest families gathered beneath ceilings painted with old-money elegance and whispered ambition. Diamonds flashed beneath the soft orchestra music. Champagne shimmered like liquid gold. And at the center of it all stood Rhett Van Thorn, the billionaire heir whose name carried more power in New York than most politicians ever would. At 36, Rhett had mastered the art of appearing untouchable. His tailored black tuxedo fit him like armor, every sharp line reinforcing the image the world worshipped. Cold, controlled, impossible to break. Tonight was supposed to be another calculated victory, another carefully staged moment for the Van Thorn legacy. Reporters lined the marble staircase downstairs waiting for the official announcement of his engagement to Celeste Holloway, daughter of a banking dynasty old enough to have buildings named after them. The merger between their families would dominate headlines for weeks. Wealth marrying wealth. Power multiplying power. Exactly the kind of future his mother had spent years engineering. Rhett adjusted the silver cufflink at his wrist as investors and senators surrounded him with polished smiles, but none of their voices truly reached him. His attention drifted instead toward the ballroom entrance where servers moved quietly beneath towering floral arrangements and soft amber lighting. For a brief second, something unfamiliar tightened in his chest. Then the doors opened. Silence spread slowly at first, like smoke before a fire. Conversations stopped one table at a time. Heads turned. Even the orchestra seemed to hesitate beneath the weight of the moment unfolding across the ballroom floor. A woman dressed in black stepped inside with the kind of elegance money could never manufacture. Zariah Cole moved with calm, measured grace, her satin gown catching fragments of chandelier light with every step she took across the marble floor. 3 years had transformed her softness into something breathtakingly dangerous. Her dark curls framed a face no longer touched by fear, no longer searching for permission to exist in rooms like this one. Beside her walked 2 small children wearing matching white tuxedos. A little boy, a little girl. Their tiny hands rested comfortably in hers as they stared wide-eyed at the glittering ballroom around them. Rhett's breathing stopped. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly, because the little boy had his eyes. The exact same storm-gray eyes Rhett saw every morning in the mirror. Around the ballroom, whispers exploded beneath careful breaths and horrified glances. Celeste Holloway's smile faded instantly as confusion spread across her perfect face. But Rhett barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the woman standing beneath the chandeliers and the twins beside her. Memories crashed into him without mercy. A quiet penthouse kitchen after midnight. The scent of vanilla coffee drifting through winter air. Zariah laughing softly while snow pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. The way she used to lower her eyes whenever he looked at her too long, as if she already knew loving a man like him could destroy her. And then the memory he had spent 3 years trying not to remember. Her trembling fingers wrapped around a pregnancy test. His mother's icy voice. The silence that followed. Zariah finally lifted her gaze toward him from across the ballroom. Calm, steady, untouchable. Rhett Van Thorn had spent his life building empires out of steel, glass, and fear. But in a single heartbeat, the woman he abandoned returned holding the only thing powerful enough to bring his entire kingdom to its knees. There are moments in life when the truth does not arrive with screaming or chaos. Sometimes it enters a room dressed in black silk and quiet dignity, carrying 2 children with familiar eyes. The Beaumont Grand Ballroom remained frozen beneath the chandelier light as Zariah Cole continued walking across the marble floor without hesitation. Every camera slowly turned toward her. Every whispered conversation dissolved into stunned silence. Yet she moved as though none of them existed, as though she had already survived worse than judgment from strangers wearing diamonds and designer tuxedos. Little Ariel held tightly onto her mother's hand, while Cairo stared curiously at the towering ice sculpture near the center of the ballroom. Neither child understood why the room suddenly felt so cold. Rhett Van Thorn could not move. The muscles in his jaw tightened as memories clawed their way back into his mind with terrifying clarity. 3 years ago, Zariah had looked very different standing inside his penthouse kitchen after midnight, wearing a simple cream-colored housekeeping uniform and soft slippers that barely made noise against the hardwood floors. Back then, she carried exhaustion in her eyes but also warmth. A quiet kindness that somehow survived the impossible pressure of working inside a world designed to make people like her invisible. Rhett remembered the first real conversation they ever had. A December snowstorm had shut down half of Manhattan, trapping him inside the penthouse after an investor dinner collapsed into another meaningless night of business politics and fake smiles. He had walked downstairs sometime after 1 in the morning expecting silence. Instead, he found Zariah sitting near the kitchen island drinking tea beneath a single hanging light while old jazz music played softly from her phone. She nearly dropped the mug when she saw him. "I am sorry, Mr. Van Thorn," she had whispered quickly while standing. "I thought everyone was asleep." But Rhett had surprised even himself that night. "Sit down," he told her quietly. "I was not planning on sleeping anyway." Strange how the smallest moments could alter an entire life. Over the following weeks, their conversations became the only honest part of Rhett's carefully controlled existence. She never cared about his money, never asked for favors, never tried to impress him. While executives fought desperately for his approval and socialites rehearsed their smiles around him, Zariah spoke with a calm sincerity that made him feel human again. She told him stories about growing up in Philadelphia with her grandmother, about taking night classes while working double shifts, about her dream of opening a luxury hospitality company one day. Rhett found himself lingering in the kitchen later each evening just to hear her voice. Sometimes they sat together for hours while Manhattan glittered outside the windows like another universe entirely. He remembered one particular night when soft rain pressed against the glass and she laughed quietly after beating him at chess for the 3rd time in a row. "You hate losing," she teased gently. Rhett stared at her across the board longer than he should have. "Only when the person winning matters to me." The memory hit him now with brutal force as he stood inside the ballroom watching the same woman he once almost loved become someone entirely untouchable. Zariah finally stopped near the center of the room beside the towering staircase wrapped in white roses and crystal lights. Cairo looked up at her innocently. "Mom," he asked softly enough that nearby guests leaned closer to listen. "Is that the man from your old picture?" Rhett's pulse stopped completely. Across the ballroom, Zariah slowly lifted her eyes toward him again. But this time there was no softness left inside them. Only survival. Only truth. And for the first time in his powerful, carefully protected life, Rhett Van Thorn realized fear and regret could sound exactly the same. The orchestra resumed playing, but the music no longer sounded elegant. It sounded fragile, like something trying desperately not to collapse beneath the weight of the truth standing in the middle of the ballroom. Rhett Van Thorn finally placed his whiskey glass onto a passing server's tray before his unsteady hand betrayed him completely. Around him, New York's elite pretended not to stare while staring harder than ever. He could feel it in the silence surrounding his name, the curiosity, the scandal forming in real time beneath crystal lights and billion-dollar smiles. Yet none of it mattered compared to the woman standing 30 feet away from him with his eyes reflected in her children's faces. Celeste Holloway stepped closer to his side, her diamond bracelet trembling softly against her wrist. "Rhett," she whispered carefully through a practiced smile. "Tell me this is some misunderstanding." But Rhett could not answer because memories were pulling him backward again. Back to nights he had buried beneath years of business meetings and family obligations. Back to the woman he once waited to see more than anyone else in the world. 3 years earlier, winter had wrapped Manhattan in silver ice and endless snow. The Van Thorn penthouse sat 70 floors above the city, silent except for the crackling fireplace and soft jazz drifting through hidden speakers. Rhett remembered returning home after another brutal board meeting where his mother spent 2 straight hours discussing his future marriage, as though it were another corporate acquisition. He had loosened his tie while walking into the kitchen expecting emptiness. Instead, he found Zariah standing barefoot near the marble counter reaching carefully for a cookbook on the highest shelf. She laughed softly when she almost lost balance. I swear your kitchen was designed for giants, she said without turning around. Rhett should have walked away. A man like him did not blur lines with employees. A man raised inside the ruthless perfection of old money society did not allow feelings to interfere with family expectations. But Zariah had become the one place where his carefully controlled world stopped feeling cold. What are you making? He asked quietly. She turned toward him holding the cookbook against her chest. Peach cobbler. Her smile appeared slowly, warm enough to melt every sharp edge inside the room. My grandmother used to make it during snowstorms. Rhett remembered loosening his cufflinks while watching flour dust her fingertips and cinnamon perfume the air between them. Such small details. Yet somehow those became the memories that survived him. She had looked beautiful that night, not because of expensive gowns or jewelry, but because peace lived naturally inside her. Something no woman in his social world had ever carried. They ate dessert near the fireplace while snow painted the city white beyond the windows. Zariah told him stories about growing up in a crowded apartment where laughter mattered more than money. Rhett found himself telling her things he had never admitted aloud to anyone. How lonely wealth could feel. How exhausting it was pretending not to care. She listened quietly without judgment, without calculation. Hours passed unnoticed until she finally stood to leave. But before she walked away, she paused near the hallway light and looked back at him. You are different when nobody is watching you, she said softly. The words stayed with him long after she disappeared upstairs. Back inside the Beaumont Grand Ballroom, Rhett stared at the same woman now transformed into someone untouchable. Cairo wandered slightly away from his mother's side and stopped beside one of the enormous ballroom mirrors framed in gold. The little boy studied his reflection curiously before looking toward Rhett again. Mom, he asked innocently, why does he look like me? A painful silence spread instantly across the room. Zariah closed her eyes for half a second as though steadying herself against old wounds reopening beneath chandelier light. Then she answered with calm elegance that somehow hurt Rhett more than anger ever could. Because sometimes, she said softly, life has a way of bringing the truth back home. The truth did not explode inside the ballroom that night. It spread slowly, like cracks beneath frozen glass. Guests pretended to sip champagne while secretly watching every movement between Rhett Van Thorn and the woman he once erased from his world. The orchestra continued playing soft classical music beneath the chandeliers, but the elegant melody could not hide the tension wrapping itself around every table in the Beaumont Grand. Celeste Holloway finally stepped forward, her silver gown shimmering beneath the lights like sharpened steel. Rhett, she said carefully, someone needs to explain what is happening. But before he could answer, Cairo pointed toward the enormous engagement portrait displayed near the ballroom staircase. The photograph showed Rhett and Celeste standing together beneath golden lighting, polished and perfect like two people advertising a luxury brand instead of a future marriage. Mom, Cairo whispered innocently. Is that his wife? The question sliced through the room with terrifying precision. Zariah lowered herself gracefully beside her son, smoothing the sleeve of his tiny white tuxedo with steady fingers. No, baby, she answered softly. That is just someone standing beside him. Rhett felt the words hit harder than any accusation could have. Because once upon a time, Zariah had stood beside him too. 3 years earlier, spring rain had washed silver streaks across the penthouse windows, while Manhattan disappeared beneath clouds and restless traffic below. Rhett remembered that evening with painful clarity because it had been the first time he allowed himself to believe impossible things. Zariah sat curled into the corner of the oversized sofa wearing one of his cashmere sweaters, while paperwork from Van Thorn Group covered the glass coffee table untouched. She had fallen asleep waiting for him after another 16-hour workday. The soft lamp beside her painted golden shadows across her deep brown skin, while jazz music drifted quietly through the penthouse speakers. Rhett stood in the doorway longer than he should have, simply watching her breathe. Peace looked unfamiliar inside his world, but somehow she carried it naturally. When Zariah finally opened her eyes, she smiled sleepily. You are home late again. Board meeting, he answered quietly while loosening his tie. My mother thinks exhaustion builds character. Zariah laughed softly before sitting up straighter beneath the oversized sweater sleeves. No, she teased gently. I think rich people just enjoy suffering in expensive buildings. Rhett surprised himself by laughing too. A real laugh. The kind he rarely allowed anyone to hear. She walked toward the kitchen to warm his dinner while rain tapped softly against the window's 70 floors above Manhattan. He remembered watching her move through the penthouse with effortless warmth, transforming cold marble and steel into something resembling home. Later that night, after dinner plates sat abandoned beside untouched business files, Zariah stood near the windows staring down at the glowing city below. Do you ever get tired? She asked quietly. Rhett stepped beside her. Of what? Pretending you do not feel lonely. The silence between them deepened. Honest. Dangerous. Rhett turned toward her slowly. She should have looked away. She always did whenever his attention lingered too long. But that night she did not. Her eyes held his steadily beneath the reflection of city lights. No fear. No ambition. Just truth. He reached for her hand carefully as though touching something sacred. You make this place feel different, he admitted softly. Zariah's breath caught for half a second before she whispered. Maybe because people are different when they are loved properly. Back inside the ballroom, Rhett stared at her now standing beneath crystal chandeliers looking more untouchable than anyone born into wealth. The same woman who once made his empty penthouse feel alive now stood surrounded by whispers and judgment because of him. Ariel suddenly tugged gently on Zariah's hand. Mommy? She asked quietly. Why is that man looking at us like he wants to cry? Rhett closed his eyes for one brief moment as the room fell silent again. Because children did not understand power or reputation. But they always recognized regret. There are wounds that do not bleed in public. They simply stand beneath chandelier light wearing a calm expression while the people who caused them slowly fall apart. The Beaumont Grand Ballroom had become unbearably quiet now. Even the reporters near the entrance sensed something sacred and dangerous unfolding between Rhett Van Thorn and the woman he once allowed to disappear from his life. Celeste Holloway crossed her arms tightly, her polished composure beginning to fracture beneath the whispers surrounding the room. Rhett? She said more sharply this time. Who exactly is this woman? But before he could speak, another voice answered first. Someone your family should have respected 3 years ago. Every head turned toward the top of the marble staircase where Evelyn Van Thorn descended slowly beneath the golden lights. Rhett's mother carried elegance the way royalty carried crowns. Perfect posture, perfect diamonds, perfect control. Yet the moment her eyes landed on Zariah Cole, something unfamiliar darkened her expression. Not surprise, recognition. Zariah remained calm beside her children while Cairo leaned sleepily against her arm after hours beneath overwhelming ballroom noise and flashing cameras. Ariel quietly played with the ribbon tied around her mother's wrist, innocent to the storm unfolding around them. Evelyn stopped only a few feet away. You should not have come here, she said coldly. Rhett's jaw tightened instantly, but Zariah simply lifted her chin with quiet dignity. Actually, she replied softly, your company invited mine. The silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut crystal. 3 years earlier, Zariah had stood inside the exact same city feeling very different. Hopeful, terrified, pregnant. The memory returned to Rhett with brutal precision. Rain hammered against the penthouse windows while Manhattan disappeared beneath gray skies and endless traffic lights blurred by water. Zariah stood outside his office clutching a small white paper bag from the pharmacy so tightly the edges bent beneath her trembling fingers. Inside rested 2 pregnancy tests, 2 pink lines on both. Her heart had pounded so loudly she could barely hear the elevator doors opening behind her. She remembered practicing the words during the entire subway ride downtown. He deserves to know. Maybe this changes everything. Maybe love changes people. When she finally stepped into Rhett's office, he barely looked up from the contracts spread across his desk. I cannot talk long tonight, he said distractedly. My mother arranged a family dinner. Zariah forced herself to smile despite the shaking in her chest. I just needed a minute. Rhett finally noticed her expression and stood slowly from behind the desk. Zariah. She handed him the pregnancy tests without speaking. The room became impossibly still. Rhett stared down at the tiny plastic sticks as if his entire world had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. You are pregnant, he whispered. She nodded carefully. Twins. For one brief second, something vulnerable crossed his face. Fear. Shock. Wonder. Zariah remembered thinking maybe everything would be okay. Until the office doors opened. Evelyn Van Thorn entered without warning, dressed in ivory silk and diamonds sharp enough to intimidate presidents. Her eyes moved from Rhett's frozen expression to the pregnancy tests in his hand and finally toward Zariah standing silently near the desk. The temperature inside the room seemed to disappear instantly. Leave us, Evelyn ordered coldly. But Zariah stayed where she was. This involves me too. Evelyn's expression hardened. No, she replied quietly. It involves my son's future. You are simply a complication. Back inside the ballroom, Rhett stared at his mother, now standing only feet away from the children she once erased before they were even born. Cairo looked up innocently at Evelyn. Mom, he whispered softly. Who is that lady? Zariah smoothed his tiny tuxedo jacket gently before answering without taking her eyes off Evelyn Van Thorn. Someone, she said calmly, who taught me exactly how expensive silence can become. The most painful betrayals are not always spoken loudly. Sometimes they arrive dressed in pearls and polite smiles while the person you love stands beside you saying nothing at all. The ballroom air had become unbearably heavy now. Reporters pretended to focus on charity speeches while secretly recording every glance exchanged between the Van Thorn family and the woman standing calmly beneath the chandeliers with two children carrying the billionaire's face. Rhett could barely breathe beneath the pressure crushing his chest. Because for the first time in years, he was no longer remembering events the way his family had rewritten them. He was remembering the truth. 3 years earlier, after Evelyn Van Thorn ordered Zariah out of the office, silence had swallowed the room whole. Rain pressed violently against the skyscraper windows while city lights flickered across the marble floor beneath their feet. Zariah stood frozen beside the desk, one trembling hand resting protectively over her stomach. Rhett remembered wanting to speak, wanting to stop what was happening before it destroyed everything. But years of obedience had wrapped around his throat tighter than love ever could. Evelyn crossed slowly toward Zariah with cold elegance sharpened by generations of power. Do you understand what happens if this becomes public? She asked quietly. Zariah lifted her chin despite the fear swimming in her eyes. I did not come here for money.
No, Evelyn replied smoothly.
You came here because women like you mistake attention for opportunity. Rhett remembered the exact moment Zariah looked toward him searching for something. Protection, love, humanity, anything. The silence he gave her instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rhett, she whispered softly. One word, one chance. But his mother answered before he could. My son has responsibilities larger than temporary emotions, Evelyn said coldly. There are families, investors, reputations involved. A maid carrying his children would destroy decades of work. Zariah's face changed then. Not dramatically, not loudly. The heartbreak arrived quietly, like a door closing forever somewhere deep inside her soul. She looked at Rhett one final time, waiting for him to disagree, waiting for him to stand beside her instead of behind his family's empire. But Rhett remained silent, and silence became the cruelest decision he had ever made. Back in the present, the ballroom lights suddenly felt too bright against his skin, too exposing. Around him, whispers spread through Manhattan's elite like wildfire, hidden beneath silk gowns and tuxedos. Evelyn Van Thorn straightened her diamond bracelet calmly, as though none of this affected her at all. This conversation should happen privately, she said firmly. But Zariah smiled softly for the first time all evening. It was not a cruel smile. That made it worse somehow. Private? She repeated gently. That is interesting coming from people who buried the truth so publicly. Celeste Holloway stepped backward now, finally realizing the engagement announcement had already died beneath the weight of another woman's story. Ariel looked around the ballroom curiously before tugging lightly on her mother's dress. "Mommy," she whispered, "why does everyone keep staring at us?" Zoraya crouched gracefully beside her daughter and brushed a curl gently from the little girl's forehead. "Because sometimes people are surprised when someone they underestimated survives." Rhett felt those words land directly against every regret he had spent years trying not to feel. He remembered the final moment inside the penthouse office 3 years ago more clearly now than ever before. Zoraya had quietly picked up her purse after his mother slid a check across the desk toward her. "Keep your money," she said softly. "I was asking for love, not charity." Then she walked toward the elevator while rain swallowed Manhattan behind the windows. Rhett remembered standing there motionless while the elevator doors slowly closed around the woman carrying his unborn children. He could still hear the faint sound her heels made against the marble floor as she disappeared from his life forever. Or at least that was what he believed until tonight. Because now she had returned standing taller than every person in the ballroom combined. And for the first time in his life, Rhett Van Thorn understood that power meant absolutely nothing when the woman you lost no longer needed you to survive. Regret is a strange thing. It does not arrive all at once. It gathers slowly inside the quiet corners of a man's life until one day he realizes the empire he protected cost him the only thing that ever felt real. The Beaumont Grand Ballroom had lost all resemblance of celebration now. Guests stood frozen beneath crystal chandeliers, pretending not to witness the destruction of one of Manhattan's most powerful families. Somewhere near the orchestra stage, reporters whispered urgently into phones while camera flashes flickered like distant lightning across the marble walls. Yet in the center of the storm stood Zoraya Cole, calm as ever, one hand resting lightly on Ariel's shoulder while Cairo leaned sleepily against her side. Rhett could not stop looking at them. His children. The words echoed violently through his chest because for 3 years he had convinced himself forgetting was survival. But memory had returned tonight wearing white tuxedos and his exact eyes. Evelyn Van Thorn stepped closer, lowering her voice sharply enough that only the people nearest could hear. "You have made your point," she said coldly to Zoraya. "Now leave before this becomes uglier than necessary." Rhett finally spoke. "Enough." The single word silenced even the orchestra. His mother slowly turned toward him, disbelief hardening her expression. Rhett loosened the suffocating collar of his tuxedo as years of buried guilt rose inside him like floodwater finally breaking through steel. "You told me she accepted the money," he said quietly. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Because she should have." Zoraya laughed softly under her breath, though there was no humor in the sound. "That check never left your office." Rhett looked at her sharply. "What?" For the first time that evening, genuine emotion cracked through Zoraya's controlled composure. Not anger, exhaustion. "I left it on your mother's desk before I walked away." The ballroom disappeared around Rhett then. The music, the whispers, the cameras, all of it faded beneath one devastating realization. She never chose money over him. She chose dignity over humiliation. 3 years earlier, after leaving the Van Thorn penthouse in the middle of the storm, Zoraya had stepped onto the freezing Manhattan sidewalk carrying 2 unborn children and a heartbreak too heavy for words. Snow mixed with rain beneath the city lights while taxis rushed past without stopping. She remembered standing beneath the glowing awning outside the building trying not to cry because she refused to let the doorman see her break apart. Her hand trembled against her stomach while the elevator memory replayed endlessly inside her head. Rhett standing silent, watching her leave, choosing fear instead of love. She spent that night inside a 24-hour bus station wrapped in a thin coat with one small suitcase beside her feet. At 4 in the morning she bought the cheapest ticket to Chicago because it was the furthest place she could afford without completely disappearing. She remembered staring out the bus window as New York vanished behind gray skies and frozen highways, while morning light slowly crept across the horizon. Somewhere during that endless ride west, she stopped waiting for someone to save her. Back inside the ballroom, Ariel suddenly wandered toward the dessert table before stopping beside one of the massive floor-length mirrors near the staircase. "Mommy," she called softly. "Look." Zoraya turned. Ariel pointed happily toward the reflection in the mirror, where Rhett now stood only a few feet behind them. The resemblance between father and daughter was undeniable beneath the ballroom lights. Same eyes, same quiet expressions, same loneliness hidden beneath stillness. Rhett stared at the reflection as though seeing himself clearly for the first time in years. Cairo looked up at him curiously. "Are you famous?" he asked innocently. Several guests awkwardly lowered their champagne glasses. Rhett swallowed hard before answering. "Something like that." Cairo considered this seriously for a moment before shrugging. "My mom is famous too." Zoraya immediately looked down at her son with soft surprise. "Baby, I am not famous." But Cairo smiled proudly. "You are to us." The words landed inside Rhett with unbearable force because suddenly none of his skyscrapers or business deals mattered anymore. Not compared to the little boy standing in front of him loving his mother with the kind of certainty Rhett himself had once failed to give her. And beneath the chandeliers of the Beaumont Grand, surrounded by wealth and power and people terrified of scandal, Rhett Van Thorn finally understood the most expensive thing he had ever lost was never money. It was the woman who taught his children how to love without fear. Sometimes redemption does not begin with grand speeches or dramatic apologies. Sometimes it begins the moment a powerful man finally stops protecting his pride and starts protecting the people he should have loved from the beginning. The ballroom remained trapped beneath a strange silence after Cairo's innocent words settled into the air. "My mom is famous too." Several guests quietly looked away, uncomfortable beneath a truth far more valuable than the diamonds glittering around them. Rhett stood motionless near the staircase, while Zoraya gently adjusted Ariel's tiny tuxedo bow tie with calm hands that no longer trembled in his presence. He noticed everything now. The faint exhaustion beneath her eyes. The confidence she built without anyone's help. The way the children instinctively stayed close to her because she had become their entire world alone. Shame settled heavily inside his chest. Not the shallow embarrassment wealthy men feared during scandals. Something deeper. Something human. Evelyn Van Thorn finally broke the silence with cold precision sharpened by decades of social control. "This situation ends tonight," she announced quietly. "Security will escort them out before reporters turn this into a circus." Two security guards hesitated near the ballroom entrance, visibly uncomfortable beneath hundreds of watching eyes. But before either man could move, Rhett's voice cut through the room like steel. "Nobody touches them." The entire ballroom froze. Even Evelyn looked stunned. Rhett stepped forward slowly, his polished shoes echoing against marble floors that once symbolized power, but suddenly felt hollow beneath his feet. "They stay," he said firmly. "If anyone leaves tonight, it will not be her." Whispered shock spread instantly through the crowd. Celeste Holloway stared at Rhett as though realizing she had never truly known the man standing beside her all these years. Evelyn's face hardened beneath the chandelier light. "Do not embarrass this family further." Rhett looked at his mother fully now for what felt like the first time in his life. "No," he answered quietly. "The embarrassment happened 3 years ago." Zoraya remained still beside the children, though something flickered briefly across her face. Not hope. She had buried hope a long time ago, but perhaps surprise. Because once upon a time, Rhett Van Thorn would have chosen silence over conflict every single time. 3 years earlier, Chicago greeted Zoraya with frozen streets, unfamiliar buildings, and loneliness sharp enough to ache physically inside her chest. She rented the cheapest studio apartment she could find above a laundromat on the south side, where old radiators hissed all night and snow slipped through cracks near the windows. The pregnancy exhausted her constantly. Morning sickness arrived between double shifts cleaning office buildings while online business classes filled the few hours she had left before sleep. Some nights she cried quietly in the tiny bathroom because fear felt easier there where nobody could hear it. But every morning she stood back up anyway. She remembered one terrifying February night during her 7th month of pregnancy when the building lost heat during a brutal winter storm. Snow gathered outside the windows while icy wind rattled the walls hard enough to keep her awake. Zoraya sat wrapped in blankets holding her stomach as the babies kicked gently beneath her hands. She whispered softly into the darkness because somehow speaking to them made her feel less alone. I do not know how, she told them quietly, but I promise you both this. You will grow up loved. Back inside the ballroom, Rhett felt that promise standing directly in front of him now. He could see it in the children's calm smiles and trusting eyes. Zariah had kept every word despite doing it entirely alone. Evelyn stepped closer, lowering her voice sharply. You are willing to destroy your engagement and this company over a former maid? Rhett's expression changed then. The cold mask he spent years perfecting finally cracked beneath the weight of truth. No, he answered steadily. I almost destroyed myself by losing the mother of my children. A painful silence followed. Ariel looked up at Rhett curiously before holding out the small white rose she carried from the ballroom centerpiece. You look sad, she said softly. Rhett stared at the flower in her tiny hand for several seconds before carefully accepting it like something fragile enough to break. Around them, Manhattan's most powerful people watched a billionaire stand speechless because of a child's kindness. And somewhere deep inside the glittering ballroom, beneath crystal lights and shattered pride, the first real crack finally appeared in the empire Rhett Van Thorn once believed mattered more than love. The strangest thing about broken hearts is that sometimes they do not heal by returning to the past. Sometimes they heal by finally being seen for what they survived. Midnight settled slowly over Manhattan as the Beaumont Grand Ballroom emptied beneath fading chandelier light and exhausted whispers. Reporters drifted outside into the cold spring air carrying headlines that would dominate every newspaper by sunrise. Investors quietly disappeared through private exits. Socialites avoided eye contact. Even the orchestra had stopped playing, leaving only the soft sound of crystal glasses being cleared from abandoned tables. Yet in the middle of the enormous ballroom, Rhett Van Thorn still stood holding the small white rose Ariel had given him as though it weighed more than every contract he had ever signed. Zariah adjusted Cairo's jacket gently while the little boy fought sleep against her shoulder. Ariel leaned quietly beside her mother, tracing invisible circles across the marble floor with shiny dress shoes far too fancy for a 6-year-old child. They looked tired, human, real, and somehow more powerful than everyone who had spent the evening pretending perfection mattered more than love. Evelyn Van Thorn finally turned toward the exit, her heels echoing sharply against the marble floor. You are making a mistake, she said coldly without looking back at her son. Rhett watched his mother disappear beneath the grand staircase before answering quietly into the silence she left behind. No. I made the mistake 3 years ago. Zariah lowered her eyes for a brief moment as though those words reached somewhere she no longer allowed herself to visit. Rhett stepped closer carefully now, not like a billionaire approaching a scandal, but like a man terrified of standing too near the life he once destroyed. Zariah, he said softly. Her name sounded different in his voice tonight. Less ownership, more regret. She looked at him calmly. What do you want from me, Rhett? The question lingered heavily between them because once upon a time the answer would have been simple. Love, safety, a future together. But time had transformed them both into strangers carrying shared memories. Rhett glanced toward the children before speaking again. I do not know if I deserve forgiveness. You do not, Zariah answered honestly. The words hurt. He could see that they hurt her too. But truth often arrived without softness. Rhett nodded slowly anyway. Then let me earn the right to at least know them. Cairo lifted his sleepy head at that. Know who? He mumbled quietly. Rhett crouched carefully until he stood at eye level with the little boy for the first time. No boardroom. No cameras. No power. Just a father meeting his son beneath fading ballroom lights. You, Rhett answered softly. Cairo studied him seriously for several seconds in the innocent way only children can. Mom says people should not make promises unless they plan to keep them. The words nearly broke something inside Rhett completely. He looked up toward Zariah, realizing instantly where the boy learned such wisdom. She had raised them with honesty instead of bitterness. Strength instead of revenge. Love instead of fear. Rhett swallowed hard before answering carefully. Your mom is very smart. Ariel smiled sleepily and rested her small hand against Rhett's arm without hesitation. Children did not understand social status or scandal. They only recognized kindness when they felt it. Zariah watched the moment silently beneath the dimming chandelier light while emotions she buried years ago threatened to rise again. Dangerous emotions. Hope. Outside the ballroom windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the dark sky exactly the way it had 3 years ago, when she left the city carrying heartbreak and 2 unborn babies. But tonight felt different somehow, because she was no longer the frightened woman stepping onto a freezing sidewalk with nowhere to go. She had survived loneliness, poverty, childbirth, endless nights building a business while rocking twins to sleep beside unpaid bills and exhaustion. Nobody rescued her. She rescued herself. Rhett slowly stood again, the white rose still resting in his hand. "I cannot change what I did," he admitted quietly. "But if you let me, I would like to spend the rest of my life trying to become someone our children can be proud of." Zariah looked at him for a long moment beneath the fading gold light of the ballroom. Then she glanced toward Cairo and Ariel curled sleepily beside each side of her black satin dress like 2 small pieces of her heart standing outside her body. Finally, she answered with the calm strength that once saved her life. "We will see." It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something far more powerful. A door left slightly open, and as the first pale traces of morning began rising beyond the Manhattan skyline, Rhett Van Thorn realized the woman he once abandoned had returned not to destroy his empire, but to remind him that love built with dignity will always outlive power built on fear. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and tell me in the comments. Do you believe real love deserves a second chance after betrayal? Your thoughts, your kindness, and your support truly mean more than you know. And if you enjoy emotional stories about love, redemption, family, and powerful comebacks, make sure you subscribe and become part of our story family here on Black Maid Stories channel.